They say trust is the foundation of any marriage. But what do you do when that foundation is ripped away in a single confession? What if the love of your life, the mother of your child, admits to something that shakes your world to its core? Before we dive deeper into this story of love and betrayal, take a moment to support our channel. Ensure you hit that like button and subscribe to our channel, where we bring you compelling, real-life stories like this every single day. Trust me, you won't want to miss a single one. Now, let's dive into today's story. After what felt like the longest month of my life, I was finally on the flight home. It was only supposed to be a 2-week trip, but a last-minute business deal had doubled my time away. I had missed my wife, Julia, and our daughter so much, and each day of that trip, the ache of separation grew stronger. I wanted to be with them, to hold them, and feel like I was home again. Business had gone well, better than expected, and I had even planned a weekend getaway for us as a surprise. I was sure the time away had been just as hard on her as it was on me. But I knew that once I was back, everything would feel right again. When I finally pulled up in the driveway that night, the house was quiet, the lights low. It was late, and our daughter was already asleep in her room. But I half expected Julia to be there waiting for me, smiling and ready to wrap me in her arms. Instead, she was standing alone in the dim light of the living room, her arms wrapped tightly around herself, her gaze unfocused, almost lost. I took a step forward, ready to embrace her, when I noticed how tense she looked. "Hey," I said, my voice soft and warm, hoping she'd relax. "I'm home." For a moment, she just stared at me, and I caught the faintest glint of tears in her eyes. She opened her mouth as if to say something but hesitated, her lips trembling. "What's wrong?" I asked, concern creeping into my voice. Julia looked down, squeezing her hands together, her whole body trembling slightly. She took a shaky breath, and in a voice so soft it was almost a whisper, she finally spoke. "I need to tell you something." My heart dropped. In an instant, I felt a deep, instinctual dread settle over me. I watched her closely, my mind racing through every possible scenario. Maybe it was something about our daughter's health, or something that had happened in her family. Then, looking as if the words were ripping her apart, she finally choked out, I cheated on you." The impact of her words was immediate. I felt a wave of heat rush over me, followed by a bone-chilling cold. It was as if time had stopped, and all I could hear was a pounding in my ears. Cheated? My mind spun as I tried to process it. I didn't know whether to shout, cry, or storm out of the house. All I could do was stare at her, my hands shaking with a rage that I could barely contain. I don't understand," I managed to say, my voice thick with disbelief. She was crying now, her hands covering her face, shoulders hunched as if she could disappear into herself. "I'm so sorry. It was a mistake, a horrible mistake. I don't know what came over me." Her words cut through me like a knife. I wanted to scream at her, demand an explanation, but I felt rooted in place, overwhelmed by shock. Memories of our life together flooded my mind. The late nights talking, the laughter, the countless small moments that made up the foundation of our relationship. All of it felt tainted now, distorted by this revelation. A million questions surged to my mind, but the only thing I could manage to ask was, why? Was it something I did? She shook her head vehemently, wiping her tears. No, it wasn't you. It was me. I don't know why I did it, and I hate myself for it. You didn't deserve this. I wanted to shout that she was right, that I didn't deserve this, that our daughter didn't deserve this. But even through the rage, a part of me, the part that was a father, told me to stay calm. I thought of our daughter sleeping soundly just a few doors away, blissfully unaware of the storm brewing in our lives. I couldn't let her wake up to a shattered family. I couldn't let her see us broken. not like this. Finally, with more composure than I felt, I said, "We have a daughter, Julia. I don't want her to grow up in a broken home." My words hung in the air, a small olive branch in the middle of a battlefield. I saw something flicker in her eyes, hope maybe, or guilt. She nodded, her voice barely audible as she whispered, "I understand. I'll do whatever it takes to make this right, please. Give me a chance." In that moment, I made a decision. It wasn't forgiveness, not yet. But I would stay for our daughter's sake, and I would try. For the first time, I realized that the life we had built wasn't just ours to break. There was someone else who would bear the consequences if we couldn't find a way forward. The days that followed were excruciating. I was back home physically, but it felt like a different house entirely. The tension was thick, settling over us like an invisible weight. Conversations were reduced to polite nods, brief exchanges about mundane things, but the underlying resentment and guilt lingered in every interaction. Julia tried to be extra attentive, making my favorite meals, organizing family outings, even buying small gifts for our daughter and me. But every act of kindness felt hollow, a desperate attempt to cover the chasm that had opened between us. I wanted to forgive her. I wanted to move past it, but the betrayal was too fresh, too raw. It haunted me at night, the thought of her with someone else, sharing the intimacy that was supposed to be ours alone. I would lie awake, staring at the ceiling, feeling as if I was living a nightmare I couldn't escape from. I couldn't bring myself to touch her, and even her presence beside me felt foreign, a reminder of everything that had gone wrong. One evening, after putting our daughter to bed, we found ourselves in the kitchen. Julia was standing by the counter, washing the dishes, her movements slow and deliberate. I watched her for a moment, and a surge of anger I hadn't felt in years bubbled to the surface. I couldn't keep pretending. "Why did you do it, Julia?" I asked, my voice barely more than a whisper. "I need to understand." She froze, her hands trembling as she placed the dish back in the sink. She looked down, her face filled with shame and regret. I don't know how to explain it. I felt lonely. I don't know how to explain it. I felt ridiculous, I know, but that's the truth. I missed you. I missed us. Her words stung, and I felt a pang of guilt amid the anger. I had been so focused on my work, on providing for our family, that I hadn't stopped to consider how my long absences might affect her. But still, I couldn't bring myself to let her off the hook. "You should have told me," I replied, my voice barely controlled. "I would have listened. I would have done anything to make it right." Tears filled her eyes and she reached out, but I took a step back, unable to bear the touch that once felt like home. "I know," she said, her voice breaking. "I know, and I regret it every single day. I'm so sorry." We stood there in silence, both of us too drained to continue. I could see the guilt in her eyes, the remorse that weighed on her, but I wasn't ready to let her in again. The trust we had was shattered, and I didn't know if we could ever rebuild it. About a month passed, and we had managed to settle into a kind of uneasy truce, but the relationship felt more like a tainted ceasefire than a marriage. Most of our exchanges were brief. Our focus shifted entirely onto our daughter. If it weren't for her laughter and innocence brightening our home, I wondered if Julia and I would even manage to speak to each other. Then one evening, I noticed Julia seemed particularly withdrawn, her eyes clouded with worry. She'd been acting strange for a few days. She hadn't mentioned anything to me, but I could sense something gnawing at her. It was after dinner, with our daughter tucked into bed, that she finally asked to speak with me. She seemed nervous, her fingers trembling as she clasped her hands together. I could see she was struggling to find the words, and I braced myself for whatever was coming. After everything we'd been through, I couldn't imagine what else she could possibly tell me. I don't really know how to say this," she began, her voice shaky. "But I need to tell you that I think I might be pregnant." The words hit me like a sledgehammer. I felt the room spin as her confession settled in. Pregnant. That single word shattered any small sense of calm I had managed to rebuild. I took a deep breath, willing myself to stay composed, but inside, anger and disbelief were already surging like a tidal wave. "We've barely been intimate," I replied, my voice laced with frustration. "How? How could this even be possible?" Her face fell, and she looked away, wringing her hands. "I know. That's why I wanted to talk to you. I think it happened that night, the night I betrayed you." I wanted to scream, to curse the universe for putting me through this, but all I could do was sit there, staring at her with a mixture of hurt and disbelief. It was one thing to try and forgive her for cheating, to attempt to rebuild our lives for the sake of our daughter. But this, raising another man's child, the mere thought filled me with revulsion and resentment. "So, what are you saying, Julia?" I managed to ask, my voice a strained whisper. "You're saying you want to keep it, to raise this child together?" She looked down, biting her lip. "I don't know. I don't want to force anything on you. I'm just telling you the truth." The weight of her words sank in, and I felt as if the ground was slipping away beneath me. I had barely come to terms with the fact that she'd cheated on me, and now I was faced with the possibility of living with a constant reminder of her betrayal. A child that was not mine, yet would demand my time, my energy, my love. It felt like too much to bear. After a long pause, I spoke, my voice steady but cold. "Julia, I'm sorry, but I can't do this. I can't raise another man's child." The shock on her face was clear, her eyes widening as she absorbed my words. "What? What are you saying?" she stammered. "I'm saying that if you're really pregnant, if this child is his," I paused, taking a deep breath, "then you'll need to make a choice. Either you end this pregnancy or I'm leaving." The silence that followed was unbearable. Julia's face crumpled, her hand flying to her mouth as she tried to stifle a sob. I could see the anguish in her eyes, the deep conflict tearing her apart. But I didn't waver. I knew what I was saying was harsh, possibly even cruel, but I couldn't deny my own feelings. I had to set a boundary, for my own sake and the sake of our family. After a moment, she managed to speak, her voice choked with emotion. This isn't fair. You're asking me to give up a life. I don't even know if I can live with that." I swallowed hard, feeling a pang of guilt at pushing it aside. "I understand, Julia, but I'm being honest with you. I can't do this. I can't do this. I can't look at a child every day and be reminded of what happened. You need to decide what's more important to you, this life or our marriage." She turned away, her shoulders shaking with silent sobs. I watched her, feeling a mix of anger and sorrow, but I stood firm. This wasn't a decision I had made lightly. If she chose to keep the baby, then she would be making that choice alone. The days that followed were filled with a tense, painful silence. Julia avoided me, retreating into herself as she grappled with the weight of the decision I had forced upon her. I knew she was suffering, and a part of me felt guilty for putting her through this. But I couldn't let that guilt sway me. I had to think of our daughter, our family, and what I was willing to endure. Then, one morning, I woke up to find Julia sitting at the kitchen table, her face pale and drawn, as if she hadn't slept in days. Her hands were clasped tightly around a mug of cold coffee, her eyes vacant. She looked up as I entered the room, her gaze filled with a sadness I had never seen before. "I did it," she whispered, her voice barely audible. For a moment, I didn't understand. Then realization dawned, and a strange mixture of relief and sorrow washed over me. She had gone through with it. She had gone through with it. She had chosen to end the pregnancy. I took a seat across from her, unsure of what to say. She looked like a ghost, her face etched with an unbearable grief. I wanted to reach out, to comfort her, but the distance between us felt insurmountable. "Julia, I'm sorry," I said softly. It was all I could manage, a small attempt to acknowledge the pain she was in. She looked up at me, her eyes brimming with tears. "I did it for you, for us, but I feel like I've lost a part of myself. I don't know how to move forward from this." Her words cut me to the core, filling me with a guilt I hadn't anticipated. I had pressured her into this, cornered her into making an impossible choice. And now, as I looked at the broken woman sitting across from me, I realized the depth of what we had both lost. "I know this is hard," I said quietly, "but I promise we'll find a way through this, together." Even as I spoke, I wondered if that was possible. The damage had been done, and the trust between us felt irreparably broken. We were both grieving in our own ways. We were both grieving in our own ways, me for the life we once had, and her for the life that would never be. For the first time in weeks, I reached across the table, my hand covering hers. She looked at me, her eyes filled with a flicker of hope, but I knew that hope was fragile. We were standing on the edge of a precipice, and only time would tell if we would find a way back or fall into the darkness that threatened to consume us both. I had pushed her into an impossible choice, and now I was living with the consequences. Each moment reminded me that no apology would ever make up for the damage that had been done. Yet I refused to believe that we were beyond repair. I couldn't walk away, not from her, not from our daughter, and not from the life we'd built together. So, I resolved to take things slow. The first thing I did was to give her space, but not absence. I let her process her emotions in her own way, quietly supporting her without pressuring her for answers or forcing conversations. I'd help more around the house, be there for our daughter's bedtime stories, and simply sit nearby, allowing her to sense my presence without any expectation. Little by little, I hoped to rebuild her trust, to show her that I was willing to earn my place back in her life. One day, a few months after everything had happened, she came up to me in the kitchen as I was making dinner. There was a tentative softness in her gaze, something I hadn't seen in a long time. "Thank you," she said quietly, "for staying and for being patient." I looked at her, caught off guard by her words. "I'm not sure I deserve any thanks, Julia," I replied. "If anything, I should be apologizing for everything I put you through." She shook her head slowly. "We've both made mistakes, but you're here, and that matters to me." As the months passed, our bond grew stronger, but there were setbacks too. We had our share of misunderstandings and hurt feelings. Sometimes an unexpected comment would trigger old wounds, and we would both retreat into silence. But this time, we had both committed to not letting our feelings fester. I encouraged her to talk openly, and in turn, she began to confide in me again, sharing her thoughts and insecurities, trusting that I would listen without judgment. Julia started going to therapy as well, finding an outlet for her emotions and a way to work through her guilt. Seeing her take this step inspired me to seek counseling too, realizing that I had my own unresolved issues to face. Therapy became a source of strength for both of us, helping us understand not only our individual pain, but the deeper reasons why we had grown distant in our marriage, even before the affair. Through therapy, I recognized the part I had played in our earlier struggles. I'd been so focused on work, on providing for the family, that I hadn't been fully present for her or our daughter. Julia, in turn, had felt isolated, turning to someone else in a moment of vulnerability. This was in no way an excuse, but it was a revelation, a reminder that love needs constant nurturing. One evening, after a particularly open and honest conversation, Julia looked at me with a vulnerability that took me back to our early days. "I never wanted things to turn out this way," she said softly, tears welling out her eyes. "But I still believe in us. But I still believe in us. I believe we can find a way back if we're both willing to try. I took her hand, feeling a deep sense of gratitude. Then, Len, let's take it one day at a time. I'm here, Julia. I'm not going anywhere. We decided to renew our commitment to each other with small, meaningful gestures. Date nights, walks together, conversations that reminded us why we fell in love in the first place. Each day felt like a step closer to the love we had lost, an inch closer to the trust we were rebuilding. Our daughter noticed the change too, sensing the newfound warmth between us, and her joy brought us even closer.
If you found this story gripping, hit that subscribe button and turn on notifications so you don't miss out on more intense and eye-opening stories just like this one. And remember, your support means everything. Thank you for watching, and see you in the next video.